Welcome, dreamers. The hour is late, and the shadows grow restless. Here, in the realm of Mr. Sandman, bedtime isn't for sleeping. It's for stories that whisper in the dark and linger long after the lights go out. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a tale that will keep you up at night. Now settle in, close your eyes if you dare, and let the story carry you into the unknown. Sweet nightmares. The echoes of the vanished. Havenwood Forest was a place most people in Blackwood knew better than to speak of openly. Its sprawling mass of pine and oak trees loomed at the edge of town, dense and foreboding. Even under the brightest summer sun, locals called it cursed. Those who didn't avoided it all the same. The disappearances began on June 3rd, 1982, with Grace Holloway, a 28-year-old schoolteacher who had just started her summer break. Grace was well known in Blackwood with her wavy auburn hair and gentle demeanor that made her a favorite among her first-grade students. Her car was found abandoned at the forest entrance, the driver's side door slightly ajar. Inside were her purse, a library book, and a single white daisy pressed between the pages. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of Grace. 2 days later, the second disappearance shook the town. Marty Keene, a 46-year-old mechanic with hands calloused from years of hard work, vanished after closing his shop for the night. Marty was a quiet man, known for his wiry frame, salt and pepper hair, and a toothy grin that rarely left his face. He had a habit of heading into the woods to hunt deer, a tradition passed down from his father. His truck was found parked haphazardly on the shoulder of the road leading into Havenwood, his hunting rifle still in its case, behind the seat. By the time Sarah Donnelly disappeared, people were already whispering about the curse of Havenwood. Sarah was 17, the youngest of the 6 victims, with jet black hair and a defiant streak that often landed her in trouble. Her friends described her as fearless, the type to climb the tallest tree just to prove she could. She was last seen riding her bike down Main Street, her headphones blaring music, before she turned onto the path that bordered the forest. Her bike was discovered leaning against a tree, its frame splattered with mud. Then came Charles and Evelyn Mercer, a retired couple who had moved to Blackwood for its quiet charm. Charles, a stout man with thinning gray hair and a fondness for plaid shirts, loved to spend his mornings bird-watching with Evelyn, who was petite and graceful, with snow-white hair that she kept pinned neatly back. They were last seen leaving a diner just after breakfast, heading toward Havenwood with binoculars slung over their shoulders. Their sedan was later found at the same pull-off where Marty Keene's truck had been discovered. The last to disappear was someone no one in town could place, a drifter they assumed, or perhaps a hitchhiker passing through. He was seen at the local gas station, a lanky figure with a tattered jacket and eyes that seemed to avoid contact. The clerk remembered him because he paid for a candy bar and a can of soda entirely in loose change. His backpack was found leaning against a tree near Havenwood's entrance, its contents scattered: a dog-eared novel, a torn map, and a rusty harmonica. 6 people. No connections, no bodies, just 6 stories that ended abruptly at the edge of Havenwood Forest. The police launched an investigation, though they were ill-prepared for something of this scale. Blackwood was a quiet town with little more than petty thefts and occasional bar fights to keep the department busy. Sheriff Walter Briggs, a stocky man with a thick mustache and weary blue eyes, led the search efforts. He organized teams to comb through the forest, volunteers armed with flashlights and thermoses of coffee. For weeks they scoured the underbrush, their voices calling out names that never answered. The only sounds that came back were the rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of a distant owl. By the end of the summer, the search had been called off. Sheriff Briggs retired a year later, his face more lined and his hair more silver than it had been when the summer began. The case of the Havenwood 6 was labeled unsolved, though most people in Blackwood preferred the word unsolvable. In the years that followed, the stories of the 6 victims faded into local lore. Children dared one another to step into Havenwood after dark, swearing they heard whispers carried on the wind. Hunters spoke of strange lights, flickering deep among the trees, though no one dared investigate. Havenwood Forest remained, as it always had been, dark and silent, waiting. Blackwood was a town of slow mornings and quiet nights, where news traveled fast but never far. For most of the townsfolk, the story of the Havenwood Six was a cautionary tale, passed down like a ghost story to keep children from wandering too far. But for Morgan Bell, it was more than a tale. It was an obsession. Morgan wasn't a Blackwood native. She had moved there just 3 years earlier, drawn by the quiet charm and low rent. A journalist by trade and a skeptic by nature, Morgan had spent most of her career chasing dead leads and half-truths, writing stories that never quite paid the bills. At 34, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing and short, messy brown hair that always seemed one step away from being brushed, Morgan had a knack for digging up secrets people wanted buried. It was during one of her late-night research rabbit holes that Morgan stumbled upon the story of Havenwood Forest. A newspaper article, yellowed and forgotten, detailed the disappearances in clinical detached terms. 6 names, 6 dates, no answers. For most readers, it would have been just another unsolved mystery, but for Morgan, it was an itch she couldn't scratch. The article led to hours of research. Police reports, archived news clippings, interviews with retired officers. Every detail Morgan could find was carefully logged in a spiral notebook. The more she read, the deeper her curiosity grew. What struck Morgan the most wasn't the disappearances themselves, but the eerie quiet that followed. The lack of leads, the abrupt end to the investigation, the way the town seemed content to let the story fade into memory. It all felt wrong, unfinished. Then came the tape. Morgan first heard about it from a retired officer, a man named Gerald Price, who now spent his days tending to a modest garden behind his single-story home. Price had been young when the Havenwood Six vanished, just a rookie trying to prove himself. Over iced tea and the hum of cicadas, he recounted the day the cassette tape arrived. It came in a plain envelope, Price said, his voice low, as if someone might overhear. No return address, no note, just the tape. We didn't think much of it at first. Thought it was some kind of prank. But then we played it. Morgan leaned forward, her pen poised over the notebook. What was on it? Price hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the rows of tomato plants swaying in the breeze. A man's voice, calm, like he was reading from a script. He described each victim, how they looked, what they were doing before they disappeared. He talked about their fear, about the sounds they made. Morgan's pen hovered in midair. Did he say who he was? No, Price replied. He just talked, like he wanted us to know he was there, watching. At the end he whispered something. It still gives me chills. What did he say? Price's eyes met Morgan's, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm still watching. Morgan knew she needed to hear the tape. It was the kind of break journalists dreamed of, something tangible, something real. But when she pressed Price about its whereabouts, he shook his head. It disappeared, he said. We logged it into evidence, but when we went back for it a few weeks later, it was gone. No one knows what happened to it. The dead end only fueled Morgan's determination. If the tape existed, there was a chance it was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Her next step was the library, a dimly lit building that smelled of old paper and wood polish. The archives were extensive, thanks to a librarian with an obsessive love for local history. Morgan spent hours combing through articles, piecing together a timeline of events. Grace Holloway's disappearance was the most detailed, likely because she had been the first. Witnesses mentioned seeing her at the local market that morning, chatting with the butcher about a barbecue she was planning for the weekend. No one could explain why she would have gone to Havenwood later that day. Marty Keene's case was similarly puzzling. Known for his meticulous routines, it was out of character for him to leave his truck unlocked, let alone abandon it. The retired couple, the teenager, the drifter, the patterns were subtle, but they were there. Each of them had been seen near Havenwood in the days leading up to her disappearances. Each had mentioned feeling uneasy, as though they were being watched. By the time Morgan closed the last dusty file, the sun had set, and the library's shadows stretched long and dark across the floor. She packed up her notes, her mind racing with questions. Why had no one connected the victims before? What had they seen, or thought they had seen, that drew them into the forest? And why had the voice on the tape seemed so certain that they would never be found? That night, Morgan sat in her small apartment, staring at a blank document on her laptop. The soft hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound in the room. The story was beginning to take shape, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. More details, more evidence, more answers. And though she didn't want to admit it, she knew where those answers might be found. Havenwood Forest. As Morgan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a single thought crept into her mind, unbidden and unwelcome. What if the voice on the tape wasn't lying? What if someone really is still watching? Morgan couldn't shake the idea of the tape. The more she thought about it, the more it felt like the missing key to the entire story. She spent the next several days tracking down anyone who might know more. Retired officers, townsfolk, even the current sheriff. Anyone who had been connected to the case or the tape. Most of the answers were the same. Shrugs, vague recollections, and theories that went nowhere. But one name kept coming up, Sheriff Walter Briggs. He had been the one to receive the tape, the one who had logged it into evidence, and the one who had led the fruitless search for the Havenwood Six. Finding Briggs wasn't hard. At 72, he still lived in the same modest house on the outskirts of town, his porch sagging under the weight of potted plants and an old rocking chair. Morgan knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet evening air. The door creaked open, revealing a man who looked older than his years. Briggs had broad shoulders that had softened with age, a face etched with deep lines, and eyes that carried the weight of things he'd never been able to forget. "You're the reporter," he said, his voice gravelly. It wasn't a question. Morgan nodded. "I'm looking into the Havenwood Six. I was told you might be able to help." For a moment, Briggs just stared at her, his hand resting on the door frame. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." Briggs's living room was cluttered but clean, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of coffee. He motioned for Morgan to sit, then lowered himself into a worn armchair with a sigh. "You want to know about the tape?" he said. Morgan leaned forward, her notebook ready. "I was told it disappeared from evidence. Is that true?" Briggs nodded, his gaze distant. "It vanished, just like the people it talked about. One day it was there, the next it wasn't. Never made any sense." "What was on it?" Morgan asked, her voice steady. Briggs hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "It was unsettling." The voice sounded calm, almost bored, like he was talking about the weather. "But the things he said..." He paused, his jaw tightening. He described each victim in detail. What they were wearing, where they were when he took them, how they reacted. Morgan's pen scratched across the page, capturing every word. "Did he ever say why he did it?" "No," Briggs said. "But he wanted us to know it was him. He talked about their fear, their last moments, not in a bragging way, more like he was remembering." Morgan frowned. "Remembering?" Briggs met her gaze, his expression grim, like he was reliving it. As the conversation continued, Briggs's voice grew quieter, his words heavier. He recounted how the tape had ended with a whisper, a chilling phrase that still haunted him. "I'm still watching." Morgan shivered, despite the warmth of the room. "Do you think the person who sent the tape was the one who took them?" Briggs sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they knew things no one else could have known. Things we never released to the public. That's why I believe it was real." The weight of his words settled over them both. Morgan scribbled a final note in her notebook, then looked up. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it from evidence?" Briggs shook his head. "None. But I can tell you this. Whoever sent that tape didn't stop at the 6. I've heard stories over the years. People going missing in other towns, places near forests like Havenwood. Always the same pattern. No bodies, no clues, just gone." Morgan's heart pounded as Briggs continued. "If you're serious about this story, you'd better be careful. Whoever's behind this, they're not just watching, they're waiting." The words echoed in Morgan's mind as she drove home that night. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but the unease lingered. When she finally stepped into her apartment, Morgan locked the door behind them and set her notebook on the desk. She stared at the pages, the pieces of the puzzle that were slowly coming together. The tape, the disappearances, the strange stories about Havenwood. It was all connected. And yet, the answer still felt just out of reach. As Morgan sat in the dim light of her desk lamp, she thought of Briggs's warning. She thought of the voice on the tape. And for the first time since starting the story, she felt the faint, unsettling sensation that someone was watching her. The following morning, Morgan sat at her desk, staring at the growing pile of notes. Newspaper clippings, interviews, and grainy photocopies of police reports covered every surface, a chaotic mosaic of unanswered questions. Somewhere in that mess was the key to the Havenwood 6. Morgan just had to find it. She began piecing together timelines, cross-referencing witness statements with the victim's last known movements. The process was slow, meticulous, and maddening. Morgan's mind wandered to the tape Briggs described, imagining the calm, chilling voice recounting the final moments of each victim. It was more than a confession. It was a performance. But why? Why would someone send a tape like that, only to let it vanish? Why leave breadcrumbs if they didn't want to be caught? The victims were Morgan's starting point. Each had lived different lives, moved in different circles. Yet there were threads, delicate, almost invisible, that began to weave them together. Grace Halloway, the schoolteacher, was the first. Morgan found a mention of her in an archived PTA newsletter from 1981. A brief blurb about her love of hiking stood out. She had reportedly taken her students on a nature walk near Havenwood Forest just weeks before she disappeared. Then there was Marty Keene, the mechanic. Known for his quiet life, Marty was also an avid hunter, his favorite spot being the edge of Havenwood. Witnesses claimed they'd seen him leave town several times with his rifle in tow, heading toward the woods. Sarah Donnelly, the teenager, had been more vocal about her experiences. One of her surviving friends mentioned in a long-forgotten interview that Sarah had told her she felt watched whenever she rode her bike past Havenwood. The Mercers, Charles and Evelyn, had been frequent visitors to Havenwood as well, though her trips were less ominous. Evelyn's journal, now housed in the local historical society, contained sketches of birds she'd seen there. And then, of course, there was the drifter, the final victim. He was the biggest mystery of all. No one knew his name, and his only traceable connection to Havenwood was the abandoned backpack. The more Morgan dug, the more apparent it became. All 6 victims had been drawn to Havenwood, each in her own way. A chilling pattern began to emerge in the days leading up to each disappearance. Witness statements, previously dismissed as hysteria or coincidence, hinted at something sinister. Grace had mentioned to a coworker that she thought she'd seen someone standing at the edge of the woods while driving home one evening. She'd laughed it off, joking that it was probably a hunter, but the unease had been evident in her voice. Marty's brother recalled a night when Marty had come home, unusually shaken. He claimed he'd heard footsteps following him through the forest during one of his hunting trips. "Just some damn kids," Marty had grumbled, but his hands had trembled as he poured himself a drink. Sarah had written about a shadowy figure in her diary, a person she'd glimpsed near the old bike trail, but could never quite catch up to. "It's probably nothing," she'd written, "but it feels like they're waiting for me to notice them." The stories were eerily similar. Shadows at the edge of vision, sounds that shouldn't have been there, the unnerving sense of being watched. Morgan decided to take her questions to the locals, hoping for fresh insights. Most were reluctant to talk about Havenwood, their discomfort evident in the way they avoided eye contact or changed the subject. But a few, especially the older residents, were more forthcoming. "There's something wrong with that forest," said Mary Lou Carter, a retired nurse with a sharp tongue and steel-gray hair. "It's been that way since I was a girl. People see things out there, lights, shadows. My brother swore he saw a man standing in the middle of the road one night, but when he stopped to yell at him, the man was gone." Another resident, a wiry old man named Hank, claimed to have seen flickering lights deep in the woods on several occasions. "Like lanterns swinging in the wind," he said, his voice raspy. But there wasn't no wind, and there wasn't nobody out there neither. The stories were varied, fragmented, and laced with the kind of fear that couldn't be faked. By the time Morgan returned home that evening, her mind was racing. The shadows, the lights, the whispered warnings, they all pointed to something lurking in Havenwood, something no one could explain. Morgan spread her notes across the table, her eyes scanning for connections. Grace, Marty, Sarah, the Mercers, the Drifter. 6 lives, seemingly random, yet all tied to the same place. And then there was the tape, the voice that had described the victim so intimately, so confidently. Morgan's pen hovered over the notebook, the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. For the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. She glanced at the window, her reflection staring back. For a moment she thought she saw something move in the shadows behind them, but when she turned, the room was empty. Havenwood Forest had always held an unsettling allure, a dark presence that seemed to breathe unease into the surrounding air. Morgan found herself drawn closer to its shadowed edge with every discovery, though the growing weight of unease tugged at the back of her mind. It was late afternoon when Morgan decided to visit the edge of the forest. She parked her car along the shoulder of the road, not far from where Marty Keene's truck had been found all those years ago. The forest loomed ahead, dense and silent, its towering trees swaying gently in the wind. Morgan stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots the only sound. A chill wind swept through, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. The forest seemed to watch them as she stood there, its shadow reaching out as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The first locals to speak of the strange lights had been hunters. Decades ago, they'd returned from the forest with tales of flickering lanterns that moved erratically through the trees, as if held by unseen hands. The lights were never accompanied by sound. No footsteps, no voices, just the steady pulse of golden light cutting through the darkness. Morgan remembered Hank's words from the day before. Lanterns swinging in the wind, but there wasn't no wind. Now, as the daylight faded, she stood at the forest's edge and scanned the trees. There was no sign of light, no flicker in the growing gloom, but there was a presence, heavy and unyielding, that pressed against Morgan's chest, like a weight. Morgan took a breath and stepped forward, her boots sinking into the damp earth. She wouldn't go far, just close enough to satisfy her curiosity. The deeper Morgan went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the light. The trees crowded together, their thick trunks casting long shadows that danced with the movement of the wind. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying with it a metallic tang that Morgan couldn't quite place. She stopped to take a photograph, the flash illuminating the gnarled branches and tangled underbrush. When the light faded, she thought she saw something, just a brief flicker, deep within the forest. Morgan froze, her heart pounding. Was it a trick of the light? A reflection from her camera? Then it happened again. A faint, golden glow, like a candle flame, swaying gently in the distance. Morgan's curiosity outweighed her caution. She followed the light, stepping carefully over roots and brambles. The glow seemed to retreat as she approached, always just out of reach. The forest grew darker, the trees pressing closer together, her branches clawing at Morgan's jacket. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal, and beneath it all, the sound of her own breathing. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and Morgan quickened her pace. But as she moved closer, the glow vanished, leaving them standing in darkness. Morgan turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No answer, just the rustling of leaves. As Morgan scanned the forest, she became acutely aware of the silence. The birds had stopped singing, the wind no longer whispered through the branches. The forest was holding its breath. Then came the feeling, the undeniable sense of being watched. It prickled at the back of Morgan's neck, an invisible weight that pressed against her skin. She swung the flashlight toward the trees, the beam catching glimpses of gnarled bark and tangled vines. And then, just for a moment, something else, a pair of eyes reflecting the light. Morgan stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The eyes disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, but the feeling of being watched remained. Morgan's pulse thundered in her ears as she turned and retraced her steps. The forest seemed different now, darker, more hostile. The underbrush snagged at her legs, the roots seemed to shift beneath her feet. When she finally emerged onto the road, she gasped for air, the open sky above a welcome sight. She turned back to the forest, half expecting to see the golden light or the reflection of those eyes, but there was nothing. Morgan leaned against her car, her hands shaking. She had come looking for answers, but instead she had found something far more unsettling. Whatever was in Havenwood Forest wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Morgan didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, her mind racing with the memory of those eyes in the darkness. It was as if the forest itself had been alive, aware of her presence. The experience had left her shaken, but it had also stoked the fire of her curiosity. The next morning she made a decision. It wasn't enough to stand at the forest's edge or catch glimpses of flickering lights. To find the truth about the Havenwood Six, she would have to go deeper. Morgan spent the morning preparing. She packed a small bag with essentials: a flashlight, a notebook, a camera, extra batteries, and a water bottle. Her phone, though unlikely to have service in the dense woods, was fully charged. Before leaving, she flipped through her notebook, reviewing her notes on the victims. Each disappearance had led back to Havenwood, but none of the search parties had found anything substantial. Whatever had happened to Grace, Marty, Sarah, the Mercers, and the Drifter, it was hidden deep within the forest's shadowy expanse. Morgan's hands trembled slightly as she zipped up her bag. She told herself it was just adrenaline. The sun hung low in the sky as Morgan arrived at the forest's edge. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the ground, the trees standing like sentinels, silent and imposing. She parked her car in the same spot as the day before, the gravel crunching underfoot as she stepped out. The air was cooler than it had been, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Morgan stood for a moment, staring into the trees. Her fingers brushed against the strap of her bag, her resolve wavering. But then she thought of the victims. 6 lives cut short, their stories left untold. Whatever waited in Havenwood, Morgan needed to know. The first hour passed uneventfully. The forest was quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of Morgan's boots on the forest floor and the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. She marked her path carefully, tying bright orange ribbons to branches every few yards. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The canopy overhead was thick, blocking out much of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, weaving a tapestry of gray and black. Morgan paused to take a photograph of an old tree, its gnarled roots twisting like claws into the soil. When she looked at the image on the camera's screen, she thought she saw something. A faint shape in the background, like a figure standing among the trees. She glanced up quickly, her eyes scanning the forest. Nothing. It wasn't long before Morgan found the first sign that she wasn't alone. A single shoe, its laces frayed and caked in mud, lay half buried beneath a pile of leaves. It looked old, the leather cracked and faded, but Morgan could still make out a faint name written on the tongue, S. Donnelly. Morgan's breath caught in her throat. Sarah Donnelly, the teenager who had vanished nearly 4 decades ago. She knelt to take a photograph, her hands trembling. The shoe was a relic of the past, a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for so long, but what was it doing here, untouched after all these years? As Morgan pressed on, she began to find more. A rusted pair of glasses, the lenses cracked but intact. A torn piece of fabric, faded plaid that matched the shirt Charles Mercer had been wearing in the last photograph taken of him. Each discovery was like a breadcrumb leading Morgan deeper into the woods. But with every step, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the forest was closing in around her. The shadows seemed to move now, shifting in the corners of Morgan's vision. She told herself it was just her imagination, the tricks of light and fatigue. But the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. It appeared suddenly, as though the forest had been hiding it. A small weathered structure with warped wooden walls and a roof that sagged under the weight of time. The windows were dark, the glass coated in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Morgan's heart pounded as she approached. The cabin felt wrong, as if it didn't belong, as if the forest had grown around it to keep it hidden. She hesitated at the door, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom inside. The floorboards were covered in dirt and leaves, and the air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or dried blood. Morgan stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her weight. The walls were covered in drawings, disturbing, childlike sketches of twisted faces and shadowy figures. Photographs were tacked to the walls as well, their edges yellowed with age. Morgan moved closer, her breath catching as she recognized the faces in the photographs. Grace Holloway, Marty Keene, Sarah Donnelly, the Mercers, and the Drifter, his lanky frame captured in a candid, unsettling shot. Morgan's stomach churned as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't just photographs, they were trophies. Proof that someone had been watching, waiting, planning. A sense of dread washed over her as she backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The cabin felt alive, as though the walls herself were breathing, watching. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a sound. A low, guttural noise like the growl of an animal. Morgan froze, her blood running cold. The growl came again, closer this time. She turned and ran, the cabin's door swinging shut behind her as she plunged into the darkness of the forest. Morgan's breath came in shallow gasps as she sprinted through the forest, the cabin fading behind her like a bad memory. The growl still echoed in her ears, low and menacing, as if the forest itself had spoken. Her flashlight swung wildly in her hand, the beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating nothing but trees. When she finally stopped, leaning against a thick oak for support, the forest had gone deathly silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant chirp of insects. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. Morgan forced herself to take a deep breath and focus. Running blindly through Havenwood was a good way to get lost, or worse, she needed to think. Her mind returned to the cabin, to the photographs and drawings that lined its walls, the faces of the Havenwood Six, each frozen in a moment that had been stolen from them. And then there were the sketches. distorted figures with hollow eyes and jagged mouths, their expressions twisted into something between a scream and a grin. In her panic, Morgan had almost forgotten about the journal. It had been sitting on a rickety table in the corner of the cabin, its leather cover cracked with age. On impulse, she grabbed it before fleeing. Now, under the safety of her flashlight's beam, she flipped it open. The pages were brittle, the handwriting cramped and uneven, as though written in haste. The first few entries were mundane, descriptions of the forest, notes about the weather, scattered observations about animals and plants. But as Morgan turned the pages, the tone shifted. June 2nd, she was there again, the humming girl. She always hums when she's nervous. I watched her from the edge of the trees. She didn't see me, but I saw her. She's perfect. Morgan's stomach churned. Grace Halloway. June 4th. The hunter was careless. He didn't even notice the sounds behind him. So easy to follow, to get close. He doesn't deserve to be here. None of them do. That had to be Marty Keene. The entries continued, each more chilling than the last. The writer described the victims in intimate detail. Their habits, their routines, their fears. They knew where the victims would be before they did, as though they had been watching for weeks, months, even years. Morgan's hands trembled as she turned to the final entry. June 29th. The drifter is the last. He's different, but he will serve the same purpose. The forest demands it. It always has, and I will always obey. The forest seemed to press in closer as Morgan read, its shadows deepening, its silence growing heavier. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. She flipped back through the journal, scanning the entries for anything that might explain the writer's motives. What was the purpose they had mentioned? Why had the forest demanded anything? One passage stood out, written in jagged letters that seemed to tear across the page. The forest chooses. The forest speaks. It watches always, and it knows who must stay, who must vanish. I am only the hand. The forest is everything. Morgan's breath caught. This wasn't just the work of a killer. It was something older, something far more insidious. The journal was chilling enough, but Morgan couldn't ignore what else she had seen in the cabin. A small chest of drawers, its bottom drawer slightly ajar. She had been too focused on the journal at the time, but now the memory nagged at her. If the journal was the killer's voice, then perhaps the drawer held something else. Evidence, trophies, another layer to the mystery. Morgan hesitated. Returning to the cabin felt like a terrible idea, but the pull of the unknown was stronger than her fear. The cabin loomed before her, its warped walls and sagging roof looking more ominous than before. Morgan stepped cautiously through the door, her flashlight sweeping the room. The growl that had sent them running earlier was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of the forest. But the unease remained, a gnawing tension that twisted in Morgan's chest. She knelt before the chest of drawers, her hands shaking as she pulled open the bottom drawer. Inside was a collection of items: a rusted pocket knife, a pair of cracked sunglasses, a silver locket with initials etched into its surface. Morgan's stomach dropped. These weren't just random trinkets. They belonged to the victims. The pocket knife was Marty's, a gift from his brother. The sunglasses matched a pair Sarah Donnelly had been photographed wearing. The locket bore the initials CM, unmistakably Charles Mercer's. As Morgan examined the items, she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible. Morgan. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice had come from behind her, low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against one another. Slowly, she turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The cabin was empty, but the whisper came again, closer this time. Morgan. Morgan's breath hitched as the whisper faded into the oppressive silence. The beam of her flashlight darted across the cabin, illuminating the warped walls, the distorted drawings, the table where she'd found the journal. Nothing moved, but Morgan's heart refused to slow. The whisper had been unmistakable, low and deliberate, as though someone or something had been standing right behind her. She stood frozen, the flashlight shaking in her grip, her mind racing. And then came the sound. A soft, deliberate step. The noise was faint, almost imperceptible, a creak of the old wooden floorboards just outside the cabin door. Morgan turned toward the sound, her flashlight catching the edge of the doorframe. The silence returned, heavier now, pressing down like a weight. Another step. It was closer this time, the sound of a boot scraping against the cabin floor. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't trying to hide. Morgan's pulse thundered in her ears. She backed up against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking despite her effort to sound steady. No response. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of her heart, each beat louder than the last. And then, in the periphery of the flashlight's beam, she saw it. A shadow, tall and motionless, just outside the doorway. Morgan's breath caught. The shadow didn't move, didn't sway, as though it were carved from the darkness itself. The next step shattered the stillness, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a gunshot. It was slow, measured, deliberate. Morgan tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles white. "Stay back," she said, though her voice trembled. "I'm not afraid of you." The words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. Another step. The shadow began to shift, creeping closer to the doorway. Morgan's instinct screamed at her to run. She turned toward the small window on the far wall, the glass coated in grime, but just large enough to crawl through. Without thinking, she dropped the flashlight and lunged for the window, her fingers fumbling to unlatch it. The ancient wood groaned in protest as she shoved it open, the cold night air rushing in. Behind them, the footsteps quickened, each one louder than the last. Morgan didn't dare look back. She scrambled through the window, her legs kicking against the sill as she tumbled onto the damp forest floor. The forest was darker than Morgan remembered, the trees towering like silent sentinels. She grabbed the flashlight from her bag, its beam cutting through the shadows as she stumbled forward. The footsteps didn't stop. They echoed from somewhere behind, steady and unrelenting, always just out of sight. "Morgan." The whisper came again, low and rasping, carried on the wind. Morgan's stomach churned. The voice wasn't coming from behind her. It was ahead. Panic surged as Morgan veered off the trail, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Branches snagged at her clothes, leaves crunching beneath her boots. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger, as though the forest itself was alive, drawing them deeper into its grasp. The footsteps followed, closer now, matching her every move. Morgan stumbled, her knee striking a root. Pain flared, but she pushed herself up, adrenaline drowning out everything else. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Morgan, don't run." Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing bathed in pale moonlight. Morgan burst into the open, her chest heaving, her heart pounding like a drum. The clearing was eerily quiet, the air unnaturally still. At its center stood an old stone well, its edges worn smooth by time. Morgan approached cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The well seemed out of place, as though it had been forgotten by the world. And then she heard it. A faint sound, like water dripping against stone, echoing up from the depths of the well. Morgan leaned closer, her flashlight illuminating the darkness within. The beam caught something, a glint of light, like eyes staring back at them from the shadows. She stumbled back, her breath catching. From behind, the footsteps stopped. Morgan turned slowly, her body trembling. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and motionless, its features obscured by shadow. The flashlight flickered as it landed on the figure's face. or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only darkness, a hollow void that seemed to swallow the light. Morgan's body froze, her mind screaming for them to move, but her legs refused to obey. The figure at the edge of the clearing didn't advance, didn't retreat, it simply stood there, its void-like face a gaping absence in the dim light. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air so thick and cold that Morgan's lungs burned with each shallow inhale. Then the figure tilted its head, the movement almost curious. "You came looking for answers," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping stone, "and now you've found them." Morgan's fight-or-flight instinct finally kicked in. She turned on her heel and bolted toward the opposite edge of the clearing, her flashlight bouncing wildly as it illuminated the trees ahead. Branches clawed at her arms and face, the underbrush snagging her legs. The sound of footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, and far too close. "Morgan," the voice called, louder now, reverberating through the forest as if it came from everywhere at once. "You can't run from this." Morgan's bag caught on a low-hanging branch, the sudden tug sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through her wrist as she landed, her flashlight skittering away into the darkness. Scrambling to her knees, she dug through the bag with trembling hands, pulling out the small handheld camera. "If I don't make it out..." Morgan's voice cracked as she flipped on the recording, the camera's red light casting an eerie glow. "If someone finds this, you need to know what's happening here. Havenwood isn't just a forest, it's alive, and it doesn't want anyone to leave." The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closing in. Morgan turned the camera toward the trees, its night vision lens casting the world in shades of green. Through the grainy feed, she saw the figure again, closer now, its hollow face staring directly at the lens. Morgan stumbled backward, the camera trembling in her hands. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, its long, spindly fingers extending toward Morgan. "I am the forest," it rasped. "I am its eyes, its voice, its will. You came seeking the truth, but the truth is not yours to take." The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "You are not the first to wander here, and you will not be the last." The others, they understood. They gave themselves to the forest. "But you..." It paused, tilting its head again. "You are different. You cling to your world, to the illusion of control." Morgan's grip tightened on the camera. "I don't want to be part of this," she said, her voice shaking. "I just wanted to tell their story." The figure loomed over them now, its void-like face inches from Morgan's own. "You don't tell the story," it hissed. "The story tells itself, and now you're part of it." Morgan's breath hitched as she turned the camera on herself. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "If you're watching this," she whispered, "don't come here. Don't look for me. Don't try to find out what happened. Just let Havenwood be." The camera fell to the ground as the figure reached for her. The screen went black, but the audio continued. Footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and a low, guttural growl that grew louder, closer, until it cut off abruptly. The camera was found days later by a hiker who claimed he'd heard faint whispers coming from the clearing. The footage was handed over to the authorities, but no trace of Morgan was ever found. The video became a sensation, sparking endless theories and debates. Was it a hoax, a warning, or something else entirely? But those who dared to venture into Havenwood after watching the footage all reported the same thing. The sound of footsteps in the distance, the flicker of lights through the trees, and a voice, low and cold, whispering their name. "You're part of the story now." And so, the echoes of the vanished fade once more into the silence of Havenwood. The forest keeps its secrets, and the shadows remain, watching, waiting, always just out of reach. Thank you for joining me tonight, dreamers. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon to ensure you never miss the next journey into darkness. Until next time, sleep well, if the whispers let you. Sweet nightmares.